Hey there, art nerds! Happy Lunar New Year! This is the year of the tiger, and as a fellow tiger myself, I wanted to create a new piece of original art to celebrate. So let me show you guys how to render this tiger girl today. To begin with, I have a sketch that I have printed out using my Canson printer onto Strathmore 300 series Bristol. And I use my blue line printing technique for this, but you can use any sort of colored line art technique you want if you're working along at home. If you're one of my amazing art nerds on Patreon, I also have a printable version of this line art for you to print out yourself. If you're going to print it out, I would recommend you use a toner printer unless you feel like re-inking it. If you use a toner printer, you shouldn't have any problems with the toner reactivating if you were to color over it with water-based or alcohol markers. This is going to be an alcohol marker illustration, so I'm inking these with Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens. These colorful, easy-to-use brush pens are easy to find pretty much anywhere from Walmart to Michael's. They're not particularly expensive, they last a long time, and the best part is they are alcohol marker and waterproof. So you guys who watch the channel have seen me use these pretty frequently. I highly recommend them. I am doing my colored line art technique, so that means before I started this illustration, I sat down and I figured out what colors everything's going to be, and then I inked that with the same or a very similar color from my Tombow Fudenosuke set. Now, I do wish Tombow would release more colors. I have the neon set as well as sort of the classic color set, but we could definitely use some pastels as well as some grays and more subtle shades. So you gotta kind of have to make do with what you have. But one of the cool things about the colored line art technique is it kind of blends in better with your alcohol marker piece. It doesn't add as much contrast as, say, inking it with just straight up black would. And if you switch your colors over time, you can always re-ink it and kind of readjust that contrast. So it's a great technique. I think it adds a lot of liveliness to my art. And while I know not everybody likes colored line art, some people actually think they're kind of tacky, I think they're a lot of fun to use from time to time, and I think they add a lot of vibrancy and liveliness to my artwork. So it's a technique that I love to use for these sort of more vibrant, colorful alcohol marker illustrations. So I am inking on a smooth Bristol paper. This is going to be a thirstier paper. So if you are used to marker papers that aren't as thirsty, you can't do as many layers on, you can't do as much smooth blending, this might be a bit of a shock in terms of how the markers handle on it, mostly because these kind of papers do tend to drain your markers faster. But what I really like about them is you can do a lot of layers, they stay open longer, and you can do a lot of soft, subtle blending. So for someone who loves lots of layers, a Bristol like this one is a great option for my alcohol marker pieces. So I am inking this on top of pencils that were penciled in using a mechanical pencil with HB lead, so a lighter lead, something easier to erase. And after I've allowed my inks to cure for at least 24 hours, which means they're going to bond to the paper, they're going to be less likely to smear or ghost when we either erase or add alcohol marker, I'm then going to use a soft white vinyl eraser to pick up my graphite. But you can also use a kneaded eraser for this, and that'll also do a great job of removing the graphite without removing your inks. Now I'm going to have all of the materials that you need down in the description below. And if you want to color along with me, the line art's going to be available to my patrons over on Patreon as a thank you for all of their support. So now could be a great time to join me over on Patreon and help fund future tutorials just like this one. Now is also a great opportunity for me to point out that this video has been time-lapsed several times. Some portions have been time-lapsed more than others, just so that this video doesn't take an hour and a half for me to narrate and record. So some bits have been crunched down more than others, but it took me about an hour to ink this piece in regular time. So if you're inking, what I would recommend you do is you put on some music that you enjoy, kind of chill out, relax, and as you're pulling your lines, pull them as you're either breathing in or breathing out, and that's going to really help with line control. I would also recommend not relying on just your fingers and your wrists to do the inking and to pull your lines, but to use the whole arm as much as possible, which might mean working larger like we're doing here, and also cleaning off a large workspace so you actually have the room to do that. And I have found that by using more of my arm to ink, I'm able to pull cleaner, smoother lines, which is something that I'm really going for with this sort of cutesy, more cartoony style, is I really want those smooth, clean lines, something that's very easy to color. And that really requires the ability to pull those kind of lines and not stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. And, you know, being able to pull those larger arcs means using more of your arm, in fact, all the way up to the shoulder. So cleaning off a workspace where you have plenty of room to work is going to lead to you inking better. Patrons can find a printable of this line art at patreon.com/natosoup. Now's a wonderful opportunity for me to say thank you guys so much for all of your help and support over the years. Your support enables me to create tutorials like this one, as well as to review art supplies, and I sink all of your support back into supplies and reviews for this channel. So thank you guys so much. So now that we have our piece inked, and I've already allowed it to cure onto the paper, and I've erased the graphite using a white vinyl eraser, it's time to start selecting my colors. And I pulled a few very likely colors, and something that I like to do when I'm doing alcohol marker pieces is I like to swatch everything on a piece of the same paper. So this was actually cropped from the bottom of the paper, and I saved it so that I would have room to swatch. And you can use whatever colors you want to use for this illustration. You can use whatever markers you want to use for this illustration. You can use watercolor if you want to, but I'm primarily using Copic, Prismacolor, and Blick Studio brush markers. I'm going to have a full list of the markers that I used in the show notes, but I'll try to go through what I'm using here. And typically when I'm swatching, I swatch more colors than I'm going to need, and I put the rest of the colors kind of off to the side in the box, because sometimes I'll find that I need additional colors to kind of make a blend work better, or it wasn't quite what I thought it would be. Now, swatching on the same paper gives us a more accurate idea of how the colors are going to look, and I would really recommend waiting 10 minutes and allowing the alcohol markers to dry fully before you start your illustration, because some of these colors shift significantly as they dry. So for the background of the illustration, I'm using Prismacolor's PB179 and PB40. I'm also using PB14 as well as Blick's 217 for the orange paw prints. For her skin, I'm using Blick 217, Copic E13, Prismacolor PB95, and Prismacolor 65. For the blush on her skin, I'm using Copic 123, 011, Copic R35. For the whites of her eyes, as well as the whites on her cuffs, I'm using B0000 and 015. For the golden part of her eyes, for her irises, I'm using PB19, PB123, 072, and E47. For her hair, because she's going to have kind of tawny tiger multicolored hair, I'm using E00 and 217 as well as E34. For the black part of her hair, I'm using C3, C8, and 110 from Copic. For the more golden parts of her hair, originally I was going to go more goldish, but I decided to go a little bit more orange, so I'm using 072, 007, and YR09. For the shadow on her skin, I'm using V06. For her jacket, I'm using G00, but that ran out, but that would have been a great color for it. So I ended up starting with BG13, then PB37, and PB38. For the purple parts of her jacket, I'm using PB128, PB50, and PB51. For her dress, I'm using RV25, RV29, and PB150. For the gold that she's wearing, I'm using PB18, 037, and 072. And for her eyeshadow, I'm using PB128 and PB50. So now that I've got my colors swatched and selected, I'm actually creating a border on our illustration, and I'm using MT white washi tape. And I've tried a lot of different washi tapes, and I've found that in general, alcohol markers tend to seep under them, but MT's white washi tape does a great job of actually masking the area, as well as not tearing up the paper when I remove it. So I highly recommend it. So for the background, I'm starting with PB179, and I can see some streakiness to it. I'm not looking for like a totally perfect blend. We have a large area to cover, and that can be really difficult with alcohol markers, although it is easier with these sort of brush tip alcohol markers. So I'm going to do several layers of our background colors. So I'm going to do a layer of PB179, a layer of PB40, and then another layer of PB179 for this background. And over the years, I've done a lot of different alcohol marker tutorials here on the channel. So if you're looking for more inspiration or more fun things to color, you guys can check out my favorite alcohol marker tutorials. I'll have that playlist down in the description below. I'm also going to have a list of all the materials that I used in the description if you're looking for something new and fun to try out. To help break up the streakiness, I am using PB40, which is a darker blue color, going in the opposite direction so that all of the streakiness isn't in the same direction and it's a little bit better masked. And then I'm going back over it again with PB179. So I will warn you guys, a larger piece like this with a thirstier paper like the Strathmore Bristol, it is going to be a marker killer. You are going to use a lot of alcohol marker ink for larger pieces like this. Larger pieces though do have the opportunity to allow you to do more interesting blending techniques or get more details in there. So there's pros and cons to working big like this. But if you're working along at home from this printout, feel free to resize it to whatever size on whatever paper you're comfortable with. So for the tiger paws, I wanted something that was kind of cartoonish and would really stand out. So I'm starting with YR16 as the base color. And what I ended up doing with this is I ended up pulling some additional colors because I decided I wanted to do a gradient effect with the tiger paws. I thought that would be a lot of fun. So I went back over it with PB19, which is a much more yellow sort of color. Then I went in with PB16 to start adding in some depth, and I believe for my darkest color I used YR09, and I just kind of worked back and forth blending those colors till I got a softer gradient. So for the first couple paw prints really, I wasn't super sure how I wanted to do this, so I kind of experimented around until I hit a method that I liked. I also find that in order to get those really soft gradient blends, you want to work while the alcohol inks are still wet. Now, like watercolor, you're going to get a softer blend if you work wet into wet. Unlike watercolor, alcohol inks dry very quickly, but there is still a window where you can get that wet into wet blending, especially on a thirstier paper like this one. So the way I do this is I just work one paw print at a time and kind of work my way down the illustration. So with the majority of my alcohol marker tutorials, you guys will notice that I'm typically working with 3 brands, Prismacolor, Copic, and Blick. I'm not particularly brand loyal. I like really nice, soft, flexible foam brushes that can deliver a lot of ink. Ideally, I like refillable alcohol markers, although Prismacolors do have a lot of ink in them, and I don't go through them nearly as quickly as I go through Copics or even Blick Studio brush markers. And I'm looking for a good color gamut, and I find that the color families in Copic, Blick, and Prismacolor work well together, and they kind of fill each other's gaps. If you guys are looking for a really good, inexpensive alcohol marker that's going to last you a long time and will grow with you, I would recommend you start with the Blick Studio brush markers. Those are some of my favorite alcohol markers. They're refillable, they have replaceable nibs, and I've talked about them several times here on the channel. So now that we've got the background started, I can actually start on the illustration itself. And I'm starting with my lightest color, my whites. So to kind of start that off, I have B0000, which is a really, really light blue. And to add some shadow to that, I'm going to use Blick's 015. I think that's Horizon Blue. And I apologize, my curly hair is kind of getting in the shot, but you know, I try to crop that out as much as possible, but it does happen to creep into the shot from time to time, and I apologize if you find that distracting. So what you can do in order to kind of get more out of your alcohol markers, if you want a softer transition, you guys already know we do wet into wet blending. If you want a stronger layer, a stronger transition, then you let your first layer dry and then you apply your second layer, and that's going to help you achieve a wider variety of colors and gradients from a smaller number of alcohol markers. So since she's a tiger cat girl, I wanted kind of a golden color for her skin tone. And I've found that when I'm working with darker skin tones, it's easier for me to start by establishing the shadows and the blush first, and then apply the colors on top of that. So I'm starting with V06, which is kind of a nice middle of the road violet color, a little bit warmer, a little bit more desaturated. So it really works well with skin tones. Now, in this instance, it is going to be kind of a more cartoony color, which still works well. I don't know that I would necessarily pick this if I was doing a more realistic portrait. And then I'm going to start establishing the pinks and the blushes on her skin, and I'm starting with Blick's 123, and I'm applying it to her cheeks and her nose and her lips and her knuckles and her fingers, and then I'm going to use 011 and kind of blend back and forth between the two. Then I can start applying the skin tone, and I'm kind of starting with a base color so that we're not just starting with the white of the paper, which can often be kind of stark, especially for darker skin tones. It's one of the reasons why I really like working on tone tan papers. And I'm starting with Blick 217, and I'm going to go kind of area by area so I can get a softer blend for this. And for my secondary color, I'm using Copic E13, and I'm going to blend that back with 217. Now, one of the problems I had with this illustration is that I really should have been more assertive with rendering the skin tone on the face instead of going back and forth as much as I did. It made it a little bit muddier than it really needed to be. And I also could have afforded to have been more assertive with the blush colors and gone a little bit darker, because they did tend to get lost as the illustration progresses. So to build up more of that skin tone and more of those shadows, I'm using Prismacolor PB95, and I'm really utilizing the brush to not only fill in these areas quickly, but to also blend these areas so that we get a softer transition. I blended that back out a bit with E13, and then I went in and I added some more blush using Blick's 011, and I'm kind of just working back and forth in each individual area, trying to catch it while it's still wet so that we can get those softer blends. I gotta admit, as I was rendering her face, it really started to weird me out, and it started to look less like a tiger and more like a rabbit. So at this point, I was kind of trying to pull back how much it was starting to look like a rabbit and trying to flatten it out a little bit so it didn't look quite so rabbity in the mouth. I really wanted it to have kind of like a cat face grin going on, but while her mouth is still uncolored on the inside, it looked like giant buck teeth, which made it skew much more rabbity. So at this point, I am adding in some of my darker colors, PB65. I've also started adding in my darkest of the blush colors, and I really could have gone darker with my blush colors. So I used R35 for that, and that really could have been my base blush color, and I could have gone darker from there. there. So for her dress, I was really thinking of kind of like a hot pink reddish color, but I didn't really have anything that was exactly what I had in mind. So I'm starting with RV25 as my base color, which reads a lot hotter of a pink than it actually is. It dries more muted. Then I did a layer of RV29 on top of it. Now, ideally, I have this Copic, I think the color name is Peony, and that would have been a great color to shade it. But the problem with darker red Copics is they tend to crystallize and the nib goes hard, and that's what happened to my Peony. So I actually need to clean that Copic out and try to like revitalize it. I wish that didn't happen with those colors, and I don't know why it happens most often with the darker colors. If you guys know why, let me know, but it hasn't been an issue with Blick or Prismacolor. It's mostly just Copic. So I do need to fix that marker. But instead of being able to use Peony, which would have been a better fit, I had to use Prismacolor PB150 to do the shading. And I felt like I really kind of struggled with the dress because I didn't really have the exact color I wanted, and it was hard for me to capture the depth of color and shading that I had in mind. What I should have done with this is very similar to what I did with the skin tone, where I applied my shadows first as an undercolor, and I could have even used one of the other colors that I had swatched for her skin tone, Blick 0110, would have made a great undercolor shadow color for this dress, and then layered those pinks on top of it. But I just didn't think about it at the time, and hindsight is 2020. One of the nice things about narrating these tutorials in post, though, is it gives me a chance to learn from my own mistakes and critique my own work in a way that I can take action on in the future. I wanted her to have kind of fierce tiger eye. So rather than doing like a cat's eye in the center, I left it round like an actual tiger's eye would be. And to capture that golden color, I started with PB18. I then went in with Blick's 037. Then I went in with 072. And I allowed that to dry a little bit so that I could get some, additional striations and layers. And I turned my focus to her hair. So if you guys look at pictures of tigers, they have kind of this like white side ruff and black ears, and the interior of their ears are white. So to kind of capture that, I went with some creamy colors. So I'm starting with E00 for her hair, especially on the side, those sides kind of flanking her face, as well as the sides of her bangs and the interiors of her ear. For the next darker color, I'm using Blick 217. And then to really add in some shadow and to really help give some directionality to her hair, I'm using Copic E34 and kind of blending that back out with our Blick 217 and our Copic E00. I filled in her mouth with Prismacolor PB150, and that really helped give it some depth so it no longer looks like rabbit's buck teeth. And I decided to start focusing on her gold jewelry. So she's got like big gold hoops and a bunch of golden bells. And I'm using some of the same colors that I used in her eyes, kind of creating a more cohesive color palette. So I started with PB18. For my next darkest color, I'm using Blick 037. And then I'm using Blick 072, and I'm kind of blending them back using the next lightest color so that we get kind of softer transitions to imply that these objects are round. The only exception to this would be her brass knuckles that she's wearing. Like they're like supposed to look like cat's claw brass knuckles. I thought that would be kind of cute because she's got these tiger paw gloves, which kind of skew too cutesy, so I thought adding in the brass knuckles would kind of make her look a little bit more fierce. I really wanted her to be both cute and fierce for, Year of the Tiger. So with the brass knuckles, basically I just waited until each layer was dry and then added the next layer so that we could get more contrast and more dimensionality. And if you're interested in getting more contrast in your alcohol marker art, if you're interested in rendering different forms in a way that reads as those forms, I've got some great light and contrast tutorials for you guys that I'll link down in the description below. For the little tiger beans on her cat paw gloves, I'm using 123 as our lightest color, then 011, and then finally a little bit of R35. I'm also using that on the interior of the ear. In a lot of the pictures I saw of tigers, some of them you could see that kind of pinky interior, some of them it was more white. I thought the pink would be cuter, so I decided to go with kind of a soft pink for that. So for her hair, I really wanted to capture kind of the tawniness of a tiger without going cartoony orange. So I kind of adjusted my color palette a little bit, and I started with 072 as the base color. And I'm kind of struggling with adding highlights for this because we're going to have black stripes going across it. And for some reason, the way I like to render hair using a brush, using like flicking motions to kind of capture that highlight, when I have to constantly stop and leave room for the black stripes, it just kind of messes with my line of thought. And I didn't remember to leave it as open as I would have liked, but that's a problem that I can fix later on when I'm using white gouache to add in highlights. I'm also going to use the same colors on her tail, but I'm using a shorter flicking motion to kind of capture the shorter fur. So the next color I'm using for her hair is Blick 007, and I'm making sure to leave plenty of room for the highlight, but I did blend it back to kind of soften the transition using 037. And I'm just going to kind of work my way around her hair, and you guys can really start to see the flicking motion that I use to leave highlights. And you can also kind of understand why leaving those islands that I'm going to color in black later on made it a little bit more challenging. Now, since I was going to color those black anyway, I probably could have just colored it through with the orange and then gone ahead and used the black. But you know, like I said earlier, hindsight is 20/20. I've mentioned in my other alcohol marker tutorials that you can actually get about 3 layers of depth of color by layering your markers. So you're going to see me use the same colors over and over again to really emphasize those colors and build them up. And if you reuse your markers like this to build up your colors, you're going to find you don't need as large a color selection as you might think, because you are building up those depths of tones using the same color over and over again. So I'm using 007 for a second layer to get a little bit more of that orangey depth to her hair. And then I'm going in with Copic's YR09 to start getting more of that orange. And like I said earlier, I didn't want it to get to like Tony the Tiger cartoony orange. And the whole time I'm actually referencing real tigers to make sure that I pick good colors that make sense for a tiger and not just, you know, what I think a tiger should look like. For her cat paw gloves, I actually did want to go a little bit cartoonier because they're so cute and they're a little bit ridiculous. So I am starting with a lighter Copic. I think I'm starting with YR04. And I'm also going to start coloring in the claw on her gloves. And tigers seem to have black claws, so I'm starting with the same colors that I'm going to be using with her hair later. So Copic C3, C8, and 110. And I'm going to build up those colors the same way I did with her hair, where I'm using the same color over and over again to kind of build up that tone. Then the next color is YR09, and I'm mostly using that in the shadows. So I've had a few orange cats in my life. I love orange cats. So I think I was channeling orange cats when coloring her cute little cat paws. So for the interior of her bell, I'm using Blick's Antique Black, which is more of a warm brownish black. And then I'm using Copic's 110 or Special Black for our darker blacks, just to kind of build up that color. And I'm going to use that on her stripes as well. For the embroidered tigers on her jacket, I'm using the same base colors as I used on her gloves because these are basically cartoon tigers. They're embroidered on, so it's okay if they feel a little bit more cartoony, and it also means all our colors don't kind of just mush into each other. So I'm starting with Copic YR04, doing a couple of layers of that, and then I'm going in with YR09. So originally I wanted to use Copic G00 for our lightest teal color, and I was going to do a satin effect on it, but G00 needs a refill, so I couldn't use that one. So I'm starting with BG13, which isn't leaving as much light color as I would have liked to, so I'm not going to do as much of a satin effect on her jacket as I wanted to. But I wanted her to have this like teal and purple tiger embroidered bomber jacket. I just thought that would look really cute on her and very like Year of the Tiger. So I'm doing another layer of our BG13 to build up that color depth and also hide some of the streakiness in our initial layer, which is pretty common when you're working on these thirstier papers. And then once I finish blocking that in, I'm going to go in with Prismacolor PB37 and blend that back out using BG13. And when I say blend out, I mean I don't go over the whole area with the lighter color. I mostly go around the edges to kind of soften the transition between the two colors. So the way alcohol markers work is they don't really layer on top of each other. They really push the prior layer further back into the paper. So when you layer on top of it with a lighter color, it's just pushing that darker color and diluting that darker color back, rather than like with watercolor where you might be glazing that color on top of it. And unless you're using a more opaque color, you're not necessarily going to see too much of a difference in terms of lightness. With alcohol markers, since it's pushing the color to the back of the paper, it's a little bit easier to see how it would go lighter. And of course, I'm going to be layering our PB37 to build up that depth of color as well. And I realized at this point that my whites don't have as much contrast as I want, so I went back in with Blick's 015 to add another layer. So while our green is drying, I'm going to start in with my purples, starting with PB128. And I'm going to use that as the accent stripe on the cuffs, on the sleeves, and it's also the body color of the jacket. And one of the reasons I'm using Prismacolor in this instance is I find that Prismacolor has way better purples than Copic does. Copic has good red violets and it has good blue violets, but it doesn't have much in terms of true purples or true violets. And that's one of the reasons I still really like Prismacolors. I also think that their teals and their yellows are just better and more usable in general, especially for like, in terms of the yellows for hair color. It's a little bit more usable than what Copic has. Copics tend to go kind of brassy in that direction. So I just find that Prismacolors have a lot of colors that Copic is a little bit weak in. So I, love to augment my alcohol marker collection with Prismacolors as well, even though they're not refillable. So the Prismacolors that I'm using, I'm starting with PB128. My next darker color is going to be PB50. And then my final shadow color is going to be PB51. It looks like a 7, but it's PB51. And right about now is when I finally got a clue that, oh, I should be using some of these purples on this dress, because it was still reading much pinker than I really wanted. I really wanted a pinkish red, not just a true pink. And it also meant I could add in some additional contrast. And I decided to kind of make that mesh in a little bit better by going over with RV29 to just kind of blend it a little bit better. So while I love both watercolor and alcohol markers, one of the things I really like about alcohol markers, and I like it in terms of my work, is I can really do this fun punch of very cartoony color. And yeah, you can do that with watercolor, but there's something about doing it in alcohol marker where it has this really toon-like feeling. It has this really like plastic kind of look that I think works really well with the kind of very anime sort of cuteness I like to do when I'm working with alcohol markers. When I'm working with watercolor, I like to do kind of softer, more fairy tale-esque, more illustrative sort of stuff. But with alcohol markers, I like to go pure camp and just really have a lot of fun with it. So for the zipper teeth on her jacket, I'm starting with C3. Then I am going to start adding in shadows with C8 and blending those back with C3. And this is going to be something I'm going to go back and forth with quite a bit throughout the piece. I'm also using C3 to start her eyelashes and the interior of her eyes. And I then go in with C8, and I realize that's cooler than I'm really looking for. So I use Special Black a little bit later on to kind of darken that up and add some brown in there so it's not so cool on her face, because the whole palette on her face, even the purples, is very warm. And I didn't want just one area to be much cooler than the rest, if that makes sense. So I mentioned earlier kind of the joys of working larger, or that both working large and working small have specific selling points. And these kind of open eyelashes where I have room to get in and actually color it, that's one of the joys of working a little bit larger. So I am using Special Black to start on the stripes on her hair as well as on her ears. And you guys can see it's more of a really dark brown color than it is, you know, really a black. I do think this color has kind of shifted over time, but I'm not mad at it. It's a color that I find isn't really in like my darker browns, both for Copic, Blick, or for Prismacolor. So it definitely still has a place in my marker box. And once I finish with Antique Black, I go in with Special Black, Copic 110. And for some reason, I just really like this color because it doesn't feel as dead as regular black. It's a little bit of a toned black color. There's some other color going on in there. So it feels a little bit more dynamic than just straight like toner black. And it works better, I think, with these sort of illustrations. I am being very brave for me and freehanding the stripes on the tigers while referencing them the entire time. And I'm also trying to leave more of that Special Black visible on the stripes in her hair so that it looks like a highlight. Now, of course, I'm gonna go in and add some white highlights using gouache later on, but I like to kind of build up my highlights. I don't necessarily like them to be this like suddenly, bam, highlight done entirely in gouache. And I'm also using kind of a fur technique, which is just really short little strokes, really utilizing the fact that this is a brush tip and has some flexibility for her tail. Her face doesn't have as much dimensionality or contrast as I would like, so I'm going back in with PB65 to add some more contrast and shadow to her skin and to her face. At this point, everything is basically blocked in color-wise, and it's really just about refining it and kind of like, you know, looking for areas that kind of bother you and trying to adjust them in some way. So I'm going in with Copic E47 to add another layer of shadow to her skin, to also add kind of like some dark lines around her irises, like almost like striations in her eyes, just to kind of make them look a little bit more metallic and a little bit more golden. I'm also just going through and adding like additional shadow colors or blending some of the colors out. I'm just trying to add in some more detail and some more texture and depth, just so that there's more personality to this piece and it feels more finished. So this is the part of the illustration where it's really kind of hard for me to explain what's going on, because I'm basically just like looking at it and thinking like what needs to be done. And usually that involves just adjusting the contrast, adding in some darker colors, or maybe blending things out so they blend a little bit better, or maybe adding another layer of a different color on top of it so that it kind of feel like for example, okay, if I had like a green and I really wanted it to be more of a blue green, I might do a layer of blue. Or if I wanted it to be more of a yellow green, I might do a layer of yellow. That's what I mean by adding another layer to kind of just adjust the color. So it's really just a lot of going through and kind of evaluating what I've done and being like, oh, okay, I like this, I don't like this. Like for her hair, I went in and I did a layer of PB153, which on top of all of that orange is going to read as an orange, even though it's more of like a reddish brown, almost like a Venetian red. Now, when I have mostly finished with my alcohol markers, it's time to re-ink, because my color balance has really changed as I added markers, and I really want to kind of tighten things up. I want to add some additional contrast. I want to add some additional clarity. So I use the re-inking phase to kind of clean things up, maybe add in some new details, adjust some of the lines, but mostly I'm just darkening some of the colors that are already there so they read a little bit better. Adding this additional contrast adds another layer of darkness to it, which could be good or bad, but it's one of the reasons I like doing the colored line arts, because it's adding more color. So it's not just adding like black to the illustration, you're adding blues and purples and greens, and you're using that as part of the illustration itself. I know the line art is part of the illustration, but this is also to enhance the color. So it's a fun way to add just kind of another layer of color to your work. And once I've mostly finished inking, it's time to pull out the white gouache. So I'm working with it pretty much from the tube using a synthetic brush. I think this is actually a rigger, so it's a longer synthetic brush, so I can pull these really smooth lines. And I'm gonna be outlining. So I handled adding gouache in 2 stages, for 3 stages technically for this illustration. Doing the white outlines on the paw prints, doing a white outline on her, and then adding in white highlights. And then I was like, oh, I wanna do like some fun and cutesy effects, so I also did some white sparkles, which are arguably the least effective in this piece, but I had fun doing them. And isn't that what making art is often about, especially when you're making art for yourself? If you're having fun and you're trying something different to see if it'll work, then it was worthwhile, even if it didn't quite work out. So I really wanted the gouache to have kind of a punch for these outlines. So what I did is I went and I did all the outlines, let it dry, and then I came back and I did the outlines a second time. I let the paw print outlines dry, and I felt at the time that the piece was looking kind of busy. So for a while, I just go in and I add just like my normal kind of highlights. So like highlights to her eyes, highlights to her hair, highlights to her jewelry, just to kind of make it look like the light's reflecting off of these things and to give it some gloss and to make it just feel a little bit more fun. But it was still, she was still kind of blending in with the background too much. So that's when I decided I needed to add a white outline to her as well. So here's when I start doing those sparkles I was mentioning to you guys. And I kind of like them, but I think I did too many of them. I think I should have edited more. And that's one of the, when you work digitally, you can try something, and if you don't like it, you can always pull it back. But when you work traditionally, you can't always do that. Sometimes you just have to live by your decisions. A decision I did like, though, was I decided to paint some stray hairs with white gouache just to add a little bit of dynamism. And I kind of wish I had done more of those stray hairs in her ponytail as well. I didn't even think about it because the ponytail is orange, but I think that still would have worked just as long as I'd maybe gone back and re-inked it with orange and brown later or something like that. I might not have even needed to do that. But see, third time, hindsight is 2020. But one of the fun things about this is it always gives me ideas for new things that I can try in the future. And it's a great way to kind of criticize my work and learn and grow from it. So I embrace seeing these things that I would do differently. The catch is not to look at it and be like, oh man, I should have done it differently, but to be like, oh, you know what? I'll do it differently next time. I'm going to do a piece similar to this that gives me room to do it differently next time. So here's where I decided to add a white border. You know, looking at it again, hindsight is 2020. I probably should have gone thicker with the border on her because that would have popped her out more from the background. So I either should have done no border at all or done a thicker border. But again, I had fun with it. And this is a great learning opportunity for things that I could do differently in the future. And maybe if you decide to color along with me with the line art, you'll try some of the things that I mentioned and maybe it'll work or maybe it won't, but we'll have learned something and it'll be kind of a cool collaborative experience. I mean, only if you want to, no pressure. So that white outline obscured a lot of my inks and kind of muddied the waters a bit. So once it dried, I decided to go back in and re-ink it for a third time just to tighten up some of those details and kind of refine it. But you know, I had a lot of fun throughout this piece. I had fun drawing it. I had fun inking it. I had fun coloring it. I had fun inking it again. I had fun adding gouache and I had fun inking it a third time. So I have no regrets. I think this piece turned out really cute. I'm really glad that I can share it with you. So all that's left is to remove our washi tape, and that leaves us with some fairly nice clean borders. There were some areas that just for cropping and framing, I had taped over some of my inks, as you guys will see. You could leave those as they are, or you could use some gouache just to kind of obscure those. I would love to crop that side, but my paper cutter is just not quite big enough for it, and I cannot cut a straight line to save my life without a paper cutter, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is. And here we have our finished Year of the Tiger alcohol marker tutorial and illustration. I think she turned out super cute, and I'm really glad that I could share this with you guys. So if you want to color along, my awesome art nerds have access to a printable version of the line art. There's going to be a colored version as well as a black and white version at patreon.com/natosoup. If you guys are new here, hi, welcome, happy new year. If you like what you saw, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that subscribe button and click the bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to hear more from me. I update twice a week with art supply reviews and fun tutorials, and I'm working on getting back into making comics. I have a bunch of comic tutorials here on the channel, and I really want to get back to working on what I love, comics. So if you're interested in making comics, hopefully you guys will stick around and check those out as well. I hope you guys have a happy Lunar New Year. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and hopefully this was helpful in you guys making art a habit. Hopefully I'll see you guys again really soon. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.